I expect every one of us has had the experience where things did not turn out quite the way you expected them to. The restaurant that did not live up to the hype. That vacation you'd like to forget. The 10-year-old with their very first puppy. It's not quite what they expected. I've mentioned my sister, who at one point in her life had 5 boys under the age of 5. And she said to me, "Life is never what you expected it would be." For many people, that phrase describes their experience with the Christian life, with church. What they thought Christianity and going to church was going to be like turns out to be not what it really was at all. And something like disappointment can settle in. That was the very same experience that these 2 disciples traveling from Jerusalem to Emmaus on that first Easter. They had seen firsthand every hope they had completely smashed, crushed, obliterated. There was nothing left. And something was about to happen that would completely change that despair. They encountered Jesus, but they didn't know it. This very familiar story that I read the beginning of to you describes how very easy it is to try to make Jesus fit into our box. We have some preconceived notions about who Jesus is and what he does and what he's like, and those ideas aren't always accurate. And the truth is, when we can't see Jesus the way he really is, the problem isn't in Jesus, that somehow he's done something to let us down. The problem is in us, that we don't quite get why he does what he does because we don't fully understand him. Would you like to see the resurrected living Jesus for who he really is in your life? If so, I've got 2 vital questions that we're going to explore in this story. First of all, what is preventing us from actually seeing Jesus? Jesus doesn't want to just show himself to these 2 disciples as alive. He wants them to understand why he had to go through what he did. And that means taking the time to talk to them without all the shock of seeing him alive in his glorified form. These 2 men, we assume they were men. It could have been a husband and wife. It could have been a man and a woman. But these 2 disciples did not recognize Jesus, sometimes because we also don't recognize him for the same reason. One of the reasons has to do with unrealistic expectations. Back to Luke 24, beginning at 18. He came up to them and asked them, "What are the 2 of you talking about?" And they said, one of them named Cleopas asked him, "Are you only a visitor to Jerusalem and do not know the things that have happened there in these days?" "What things?" he asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the 3rd day since all this took place." Unrealistic expectations. We know that the Jewish people were looking for a Messiah. They thought Jesus was him. They couldn't imagine that dying was part of what the Messiah was going to do. That didn't fit their thinking in any way. Unrealistic expectations. The Messiah is going to come, get these Romans off our back, reestablish Israel, and then life will be the way it was intended by God to be. That was their understanding of Messiah. So then when Jesus got himself murdered, didn't even put up a fight, Jesus couldn't be the one. I think in all this passage, these words, they're the most despairing. But we had hoped. But we had hoped. Unrealistic expectations. We went to the counselor, and we had hoped he could help us keep this marriage together. It didn't happen. We had taken Mom to this doctor, this specialist. She didn't make it. But we had hoped he could do something. Unrealistic expectations. And hope is dashed. Another reason that we're unable to see Jesus is incomplete knowledge. Partial knowledge can lead to these unrealistic expectations. They don't know these other scriptures that did talk about a suffering Messiah. It's like there are two mountains, one behind the other, and they can see the peaks, and they're thinking these wondrous mountains must be amazing to get to. And they imagine themselves climbing this first one and then getting to the second one, and it's going to be a wonderful trip. But the man who's been there knows about this horrible valley in between. He knows, but they don't know. And they're thinking the mountains will be wondrous. They've got partial knowledge about this trip. That's something of what these two disciples had experienced. They heard all the prophecies about the Messiah, but those ones that talked about the pain of the Messiah, the suffering of the Messiah, either they hadn't heard them or they hadn't been paying attention, because suffering and Messiah just don't fit together. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning but did not find his body. They came and told us they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see Jesus. It's bad enough that the Messiah got killed, but then they're saying he's alive. We don't see any body to prove that he's alive. And so their incomplete knowledge led to some unrealistic expectations. I wonder if there may be some gaps in your knowledge. Jesus certainly would not let this happen to people who love him and trust him. And yet something terrible happens, not knowing that Jesus has purpose in this thing. As a matter of fact, does anybody have an aspirin with them right now? A couple of you do? It's not because I need it, but you know, the culture that we live in says you need to eliminate any pain as quickly as possible. And if you can't find a way to do it quickly, look again, because somewhere
I just had to dig for it there.
Thank you. The symbol of an age that says there's got to be some way to fix this pain so I don't have to suffer. And again, I'm not telling you put away the aspirin, because there's a time when you carry it with you in case something happens and you need something to relieve some of the pain. But the culture that is bent on the idea that you shouldn't ever have to suffer anything has convinced us Suffering should never be part of our lives. Then we come to this thing that Jesus has said, that those who follow him are going to experience suffering. So don't be surprised when things don't go the way you want them to. Don't be surprised when you wind up with 5 kids under 5. Don't be surprised when your life doesn't work out every way that you expected it to, thinking that somehow because I follow Jesus, things should go better for me. Jesus isn't Coke. Suffering is part of that partial knowledge that can escape us. So as Jesus is walking with them, in the very same way that he wanted to move them from where they were to where they could actually trust him and find hope again, he does the very same thing for us at whatever point of life we are. If the first question is, what prevents us from seeing Jesus? The second question is, how do we recognize this resurrected Jesus? We don't see a form. We recognize the resurrected Jesus by first admitting that we don't know the whole story. These disciples walking along the road dejected, in despair, having given up. And Jesus walks up to them. What are you talking about? Don't you know? We thought he was the one, and now he's dead. You'd think that a compassionate Christ would have said to them, you guys have been through a lot. Let me show you that I'm really alive and everything is going to be okay. He didn't do that. And in fact, he got a little snippy with them. How foolish you are. Come on, Jesus, these guys are hurting. Bring them some comfort. No, they don't need comfort of that kind at this point. What they need is to recognize the places that they've missed the knowledge. He needs to give them the information they need so they can have a solid basis for trusting him again. And it's got to be something other than just a flash in the pan, momentary vision of him. He took them to the scriptures. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory? They didn't know the whole picture about Jesus having to suffer. And along with them, we have to admit that we don't know a lot about what Jesus wants to do. Begin to admit that. We don't have it together enough to recognize, and we need to admit that we don't know the whole story. Once you're able to admit that you don't know, don't understand, and admit that to him, then he can reveal himself to you. It may not be in a flash, in a moment where you suddenly realize, now I get it. But like he did with these disciples, he went through the scriptures and showed them all through the Bible that they understood, that they had been raised with, and they knew that the Messiah did have to suffer. This wasn't a horrible, horrible end. This was part of God's plan. And as he's going through, can you imagine doing a Bible study with Jesus? Imagine doing a Bible study with Jesus, because not only does he know the whole thing, he is about the whole thing. This is his story. At some point, he may even have brought them to this passage in Isaiah. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he took up our infirmities and carried our sorrows, yet we considered him stricken by God, smitten by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. This wasn't a horrible thing that happened to Jesus that left everyone hopeless. This was a part of God's plan from the very beginning. What they needed to see was that the real enemy of their lives wasn't the Romans. The real enemy of their lives wasn't people of other races or other creeds. The real enemy was the very sin that lived inside them. And this awfulness was God's answer to it, how to overcome it. We can admit that we don't have all the answers, admit that to Jesus, and then allow Jesus to reveal himself in the Word. And once that happens, once he shows us what he's really like, one more step, and that is to abandon ourselves to him. I've been trying to run it for a long time, Lord. Or I've been trying to kind of borrow you when I need you and tip my hat when it's necessary, but I don't want to do that anymore. I want to let you come and show me how this life can be everything you have in mind. Something wondrous that can even get through these really hard, confusing, painful times. Can get through that because you're here and in charge. I want to abandon myself to you. Look what happens next. To this point, they still don't know that this is Jesus. They think this is some amazing man who knows the Word, and he's helping us to understand what's going on. So they get to where they're going. They get to Emmaus. They go into a house. Looks like this man's going to keep on going, but they've enjoyed his company so much, they invite him in to stay for supper. They go inside, sit down. He takes the bread, breaks it, gives thanks, and they recognize him. It's him! Why didn't we see this before? It's him! He wanted to make sure that they had that scriptural, solid foundation that says, even when I'm not physically with you, you'll know I'm with you because the Word has told you and can remind you every day, I'm going to be with you. They didn't bother to finish the meal. This is probably evening. They just walked 7 miles. How far is it from Lebanon to Hershey? Somebody give us a good idea of what 7 miles travels like. Somebody with a better sense of miles than I have. The east side of Lebanon? East side of Lebanon to Anvil is 7 miles. Okay? So we're going to leave this building and we're going to walk to Walmart. And all God's people said, are you kidding? But they had met Jesus, and now they had the Word implanted in themselves. Now something had gotten on fire inside them, and they weren't going to sit here waiting. They headed back that 7 miles. Didn't matter how dark it was, didn't matter how long it was, because they wanted to talk to the other brothers and sisters and say, we saw him. We know that he is alive. And he's inviting us to do the same thing. To get that grounding in the Word that says, even if you go through the worst thing in your life, I'm going to be with you. Because my Word will be in you and you will know that I'm with you in the middle of all this. And that can create the kind of fire that can make you want to let people know, I've got this wonderful thing going. Can I talk to you about it? Evangelism is one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. And most people that I tried to evangelize have the very same feeling about it. But when I just talk to them about Jesus, all of a sudden, the barriers come down. I don't feel like a freak, and they don't see me as a freak, but they simply see me as a person who's had something amazing. And if they're ready, then we can talk. Are you wondering how to get through what you're going through right now? Let Jesus show himself to you, not with the preconceived notion of who he is and what he's like, but with that grounding in the Scripture that says, he's going to be with me through this. I love this picture. So even if your image of Jesus is not like this, he wants to share this life with you. Pray with me.